Thank you everybody for being here. Sorry, one more time. So like Lizzie said, thank you everybody for being here. And thank you, Daniel, for taking the time to talk with us today. I know that you said before when we were talking that you weren't sure what you would have to contribute as someone who is not Latino, who is not a father, but like Leslie was saying, there's a lot about your perspective, about your insights that I think people from our community and our audience would definitely benefit from hearing from. So again, thank you for being here.
Oh, my pleasure. I hope to prove my worst fears wrong.
Now, and I'm telling you, like we were listening to some conversations that you had with your dad on YouTube about the book Myth and Normal, but also I was listening to a podcast that you did on Bad Hasbara. Did I pronounce that right?
Yeah, about Hasbara, yeah, with Matt Lieb.
Yeah. And so just like hearing the way that you're able to break things down, make it very clear and digestible, make it so that people understand your perspective, I think that's something that you have to offer. So again, we appreciate you. Um,
Sweet.
So I want to just open up the conversation, something that we talk about sometimes in our workshops to try to really get to the root, to the heart of who people are, where they kind of come from, is just tapping back into what was childhood like for you. So I want to ask you just if you could, like very briefly, what do you remember of the experience of childhood like for you? What was your home life like? What were some standout
Hmm.
moments that you remember, anything like that?
Yeah.
Or
Well, there may come a time when someone asks me that question, I'll flash back to all the great things about my childhood. Um, and there were many great things about my childhood. Um, Oops, sorry, that's my cue to pour my tea because it's steeped enough. Um, the word that comes up is complicated. It was a very complicated childhood. I was a very sensitive child, born to two very intense parents, each with their own histories of emotional injury and a relationship that was fraught, to say the least. And it was a constant feature of my life. I constantly was witnessing way more than I should have of my parents' relationship. And I had a very sophisticated, no, I wouldn't say sophisticated. I developed a very sophisticated brain. I was born with a very bright temperament, intelligent, sensitive, verbal. And those qualities helped me survive because I could keep up. I could get ahead of them. I could debate and argue and write long letters to explain my position. I could be funny and clever to try and cut through the fog of their relational um, just confusion that I was always surrounded by. But the problem when you have to use your talents to survive is that they become kind of tainted with that survival energy. It means it's stressful to be those parts of yourself rather than just being able to relax into being a talented kid or a sensitive kid. You're constantly, you know, grinding your gears to try and keep up with life and predict life and to try and supply yourself with your own sense of security, which ideally we're all born expecting our parents to do for us, or if not our parents, then just the larger nurturing environment. Because as we write in the myth of normal, it's not supposed to be the case that only two human beings are responsible for creating that container for you. It's supposed to be a village. It's supposed to be a tribe. It's supposed to be a larger connection to the world. But we're living in a world that puts the onus on two usually very inexperienced and young human beings, the parents, to do it all. So for me, a lot of my childhood was coping with the lack of things that I needed. Even as I was very materially comfortable, there was a scarcity mindset in my family. There was um, an inability to relax, really. It was not a relaxed home to grow up in. It could be fun a lot of the time, and I enjoyed wordplay with my father and artistic creative expression with my mom, who's a painter and an artist, a lot of imagination, storytelling, things like that. And I was a very musical kid. But in some ways, I was competing with my father's classical music that he would be listening to booming from the living room. He's famously written about his classical music shopping addiction. So even that part of my life wasn't just a straightforward joy. And then
Mhm.
the other facet of my childhood, which in some ways stemmed from, or at least was in an intersecting relationship with the home life, was my school life, where I loved learning. I loved teachers who challenged me. I had a really hard time just conforming, and I had really hard time socially. The
Mhm.
minute I stepped on the playground on the very first day of kindergarten, I knew I was in trouble because other kids seemed to have this ability to read social cues that I just lacked. Um, and my parents would later explain to me, long before I was ready to absorb it, that that was because of kind of ADD type traits that resulted from my early childhood trauma at their own hand, just way too advanced for a 10-year-old or an 11-year-old to comprehend. But whatever it was, I was then coping with the really heartbreaking difficulty of just being around kids. And I think probably the disconnect was that I could not be relaxed, so they couldn't be relaxed around me. And what kids want is to be able to relax around each other. And I was just always very intense in people's faces, never getting enough, kind of insatiable. And that made me strange to them. And I wasn't in a school environment that could provide a container for me to safely relax enough to just chill and find new ways of connecting. So it took me into my teenage years for me to really feel like I had secure friendships.
Mhm.
And by then, my personality had changed a lot. I'd gotten, edgier and cooler, and you do all the things you need to do as a teenager to find your people. But I did find my people, and but yeah, so the childhood was intense, complicated, often very difficult, dramatic, and very, very blessed in many ways. I grew up with four grandparents, all of whom lived within 5 blocks of my high school. So I would walk to my maternal grandparents' place for lunch on Mondays and to my paternal grandparents' place for lunch on Fridays, right up until 12th grade when my grandfather died on my dad's side. So, you know, a lot of blessings,
Mhm.
beautiful extended family. Grew up in a beautiful part of the world, Vancouver, Canada, very comfortable. Um, yeah, so all of the above.
That's beautiful, man. You know, you were mentioning how you had to use those skills of yours to sort
Yeah.
of survive, debate, argue. You know, Leslie, I mean, we talk a lot about how like our kids, we feel like, we talk about the ways that we want to improve on the way that we parent and build relationships with our kids. And sometimes we find ourselves in those positions where we catch ourselves getting into back and forth with our kids and really testing our own patience, testing our own threshold. So, I think about sometimes like what are the books that my kid might write one day and the stories that they might tell. So yeah, just here like seeing you and how you're describing it, I'm just as a parent, we absorb that. We're like, okay, take this
That's
into account,
great. If I can do nothing, if I can do nothing else in my public life, it's to put the fear of God into every parent. What book will my child write about me?
Yeah, for real. Uh, could you explain a little bit though, like when you're saying you had to like debate and argue, like what did that look like for you as a kid growing up? Like what were those debates that you felt like you needed to engage in that survival state that you were in?
Well, it was just advocating for my own rights, really. I mean, I saw my parents being extremely unreasonable, and they were. They were impetuous, they were moody, they were whatever subjective state they were in, that's the way it was. There was no objective reality. I used to have nightmares as a kid, and the theme was the floor was not the floor. Like literally, the floor would keep opening up underneath me. Sometimes I would try to claw at the ground in my dreams to try and get through to the next level, but then it would be worse.
Mm.
So it was like this surreal kind of Inception style thing. Um, and that represented, I think, my emotional reality of if we're having a great time as a family, it could give way any moment. And the next minute I'm wrong and my privileges to do this or to do that have been taken away arbitrarily. There was no consistency. My parents couldn't agree on how to parent. They just did not align. Like they didn't make that a priority and they didn't have the skills to do it. And they didn't realize, or yeah, I have to imagine they didn't realize, but even if they had, I'm not sure if they were emotionally ready to collaborate as
Mhm.
parents. So first and foremost, they were a married couple in an intense, forever tumultuous soulmate love affair that consumed everything. And whatever parenting they could do from there, however the relationship was doing, dominated. So I didn't get a stable sense of what the rules were. And I had a sense that in some ways I was, what can I say, more sane than they were, and I was trying to bring them back to reality. So I would write these long letters being like, you said this, and then I did this, and then you imposed this, or it's not fair that you imposed this consequence because last week you said this completely other thing, and my friends don't have parents who act this way, and this is ridiculous. And then, so that was the long letters I would write on, slip under their door. And the problem was, and it's well, the good thing and the bad thing was it worked because when I would articulate my thoughts
Mm.
at length and with urgent art, urgent eloquence, I would say. And you can
Mhm.
hear it in the way I speak now. I listen to myself on podcasts. I'm like, is he reading something? I actually construct sentences like a writer.
Mhm.
And there's something about that that's kind of cool and makes my speaking very clear, but there is some cope in it too.
Yeah.
There's some anxiety that I have to get it exactly right. When I would do that, they would come back to me and be like, Daniel, this was a beautifully written letter. Thank you for this. We're absolute, so it's almost like I was bargaining for
Mhm.
just some basic consistency, and my collateral or my bargaining chip was my eloquence, which creates a very complicated inner dynamic. And if it wasn't words, then it would be my artistic expression, like some angry piano piece I would compose,
Mhm.
or sometimes visual art, which was my mom's love language. My parents still have a drawing that I drew at age 6, maybe, back when I was really into dinosaurs. And there's 3 dinosaurs pictured, a little dinosaur in the center, and a mommy dinosaur who's the huge one, and a daddy dinosaur who's the middle sized one, which is kind of
Mhm.
interesting to me, given that my dad was taller than my mom, but I made her huge. Um, give that one to Freud and find out what he says. But the little dinosaur has tears just pouring out of his eyes in every direction. And he's looking up at these 2 dinosaurs who are roaring and gnashing their teeth and baring their claws and fangs at him. And the caption says, is this the proper way to treat a child? And I wasn't sending this to the UN. I wasn't like taking this to city council or to child protective services. I was giving it to them as a kind of plea.
Mhm.
And again, when I would do that, they would be so delighted and proud of me. So it
Mhm.
almost felt like my trauma or my pain, it wasn't entertainment for them so much as it was, they could understand it if it was done impeccably. But just, I couldn't just be a kid and be pissed off and have a tantrum. That was immature. That was wrong. That was,
Yeah.
I had to do it in the way they liked. So basically, I had to take care of them emotionally.
Well,
And that
can I ask you
fucks
real?
a person up.
Yeah, let me ask you on that, because you're saying like you're trying to communicate to your parents the kind of distress you're feeling and all these emotions, and if you articulated it in a way that they found suitable, there was one reaction versus if you articulated it in a less articulate, more tantrum kind of way. I'm curious, what were the different responses you would see? So if you weren't up to their standards, what was the response versus if you wrote a really beautiful letter and a piece of art, what were the responses there?
Well, again, I'll go to my dreams as evidence of that because I think my dreams were pretty faithful to my emotional reality. So in one dream, I'm in our back alley coming home from my little Norwegian friend's place playing, and I get cornered by my mom in the alley, and she's just nattering at me anxiously and nagging me and making me wrong, and I can't even understand her words, and I can't get a word in edgewise. In another dream, my dad is the big bad wolf, and I'm in the basement, and his shadow looms up under from behind me, and I can see it on the floor in front of me. And I'd go to cry or to say something, and I can't speak. I have no voice. So my dad would rage, and my mom would pester and
Filibuster.
uh, filibuster, and in a very high strung, anxious way, um, let sort of dump her tension onto me, I would say. And both of them would just be completely swept away by their own subjective states. And so the message of it was, you're bad, you're wrong, you're misbehaving. And this went on really until I was about 7 or 8 years old. And they finally, because I just, we write about in the myth of normal attachment versus authenticity.
Mhm.
which is the fundamental tension for all kids, and that usually attachment wins. Well, attachment does always win, but in my case, I had this strong authenticity vibe as well. So I wasn't going to completely sell out on my authenticity. I needed them to fucking hear my point of view. Now, if I'd fully been authentic, if I'd fully had the freedom and the privilege to be authentic, I would have gone and stayed with my grandparents, or my, like, I would have gotten out of there. I
Mhm.
didn't have that. So I had to stay related to them. So my bargaining, the problem with the bargaining for some kind of compromise was I'm still trying to win them over. But me, unlike a lot of kids, had a strong, rebellious, you're not going to dominate me vibe, which created a kind of triangulated three-way dynamic, which then now all of a sudden maybe it would be me and my dad against my mom, or me and my mom against my dad, which is a new kind of unhealthy. And now my brother is born into this, and he's born into this family where now there's this three-way dynamic around him, this civil war going on. But
Mhm.
at a certain point, my parents threw up their hands and said, "We don't know what to do with this kid. He's just," and they still speak about it this way. They didn't
Mhm.
know what to do with me. I couldn't be controlled, and all they knew was control. But they were
Mhm.
very bad at. They couldn't even control themselves, much less control me. So they
Mhm.
took me to see this up and coming child psychologist in Vancouver called Gordon Neufeld, who you might have heard of.
Mhm.
Him and my dad went on to write a book together, but they first met him when they took me to see him. And they planted me in his office, and he talked to me for half an hour. And then he said, "Okay, can you go outside and ask your parents to come in?" And I went out in the lobby, or the waiting room, and I sat there just kind of reading National Geographic magazines while they were talking to him. And then he brought us all in, and he said to my parents, or maybe he said this while I wasn't in the room, I forget, but the message to them was, "Your son isn't the problem, you are."
Mhm.
And from then on, they started trying to adjust, but it was an awkward learning curve because they just had some fundamental, I don't know. I mean, I guess the most neutral way of saying it is just challenges, just built-in challenges.
When when
Um,
when you heard Gordon say, "Hey, your son is not the problem, you are," what was your reaction as the son
choir,
who want to be
choirs,
diagnosed?
yeah, choirs of angels sang.
Mhm.
It's like, finally, like I knew it, but also kind of like fucking finally, like I couldn't get those years back, you know.
Yeah.
But I felt very, very relieved and vindicated
Mhm.
to be depathologized by someone that they had to listen to.
Mhm.
Um, and by that point, I was kind of jaded about them. So all of their attempts to onboard new parenting practices, I was hip. I was very woke to their tricks in the original sense of the word woke. You know, like stay woke, brother. Like I was hip to the technology of my parents. You know, regime. So I would take their parenting books down from the shelf. Enlightened Parents and Enlightened Children, The Drama of the Gifted Child by Alice Miller, who, by the way, was a complete monster to her own son. That's a whole other story. There's a great documentary about it. But she stood up for the rights of kids all over the world. But I would read their parenting books that they were reading so I could get hip to their tricks in advance because I didn't want some artificial techniques used on me. I just wanted a relationship with I wanted what my other friends had. Now, some of my friends had parents who would yell at them, who were strict, who, whatever. There was things I didn't envy, but what I did envy was a kind of just sense of just people living in a house together who were comfortable in their own skins enough to just have a good time sometimes and have conflict sometimes, and the artifice and exertion of my parents' parenting and the fact that their relationship continued to be very, very much the engine of the mood of the home
Mhm.
left me feeling pretty distrustful, I would say. And so I wasn't very open to their parenting techniques. But when
Yeah.
they did relax, when they did just let me be me, it was great. We had great chemistry. Me and my mom, me and my dad. Like there were always so many points of connection. And I think I really did respond to, and this is what Gordon Neufeld, I think, was certainly is what he teaches a lot of parents, is that it's the relationship that's primary, not the parent. There is parenting is a relationship and it's an instinct.
Hmm. Yeah, man. I think when you're saying like how the parents or your parents were using these books, and what you mentioned about, Alice being a proponent of child rights and fighting for children, and then seeing it not translate. I think again that's
Not
something.
only not translate, but translate into into the like I'm talking about sadism,
Mm,
all the way into her son's adulthood. I mean, in his childhood, she stood by and watched, he claims, as his father beat him mercilessly until he was 16 every single day. So I don't know if that's sadism or just a kind of weakness of character or her own fear or whatever. But then into his adulthood, she would gaslight him and blame him for his own problems and lecture him about how he has to grow up. And just some of the letters she wrote him are unbelievable, coming from someone who purportedly understands the plight of traumatized children. And you know, my father is a much better person than that,
mhm.
and a much more sincere and uh, earnest student of his own development, and much more committed, I think, to having genuine relationships with adult kids. But still, as the son of a famous parenting expert,
Mhm.
I felt a lot of feelings watching that, you know?
Well, can you talk about that specifically? Because, first off, like how early on as a kid did you come to see your dad's work for what it was, that he's going out there helping people with their relationship with their kids? How early on did you, catch on to that? And what was it like when you realized that this is who your dad is and this is the work that he does, but you're not seeing that at home and you're not seeing
Well,
that?
yeah, the thing is, he wasn't doing that when I was a kid. He was a doctor. He was just a GP.
Mhm.
Literally, my dad was not a therapist, and he's still not a therapist by training. He's got an MD, and he had a private medical practice, general practitioner medical practice, family doctor in the east side of Vancouver. He treated a lot of immigrants, and he was kind of a local hero, kind of working class hero doctor.
Mhm.
Um, and I knew that he was very well respected. I knew he was a workaholic. I knew he was out there in the world taking care of people, and that caused him to not be home very much. And when he was home, he was sullen and moody or rageful. And he's written about that extensively. I don't need to tell that story. The first time I remember him starting to connect the dots between physical ailments and mental ailments on the one hand, and people's childhoods, was around the late 90s, which led him to write his first book, Scattered Minds, on attention deficit disorder. And I remember when he took my brother Aaron and I out for dinner one night, or for lunch, and he said, "Okay, boys, you pick the restaurant, I pick the topic." And we went to Fog and Suds, this beer and burger place. And I was in my early 20s by this point, so I had a beer and a burger and a Caesar salad. And he pulls out this big stack of papers of like books, medical research and stuff. He says, "Attention deficit disorder. I have it. I believe the two of you have it. I believe your mom has it. I believe your sister has it. And it's not genetic. And I believe it's an adaptation to a stressed environment. And here's why." And we're sitting there, I'm sipping my beer and eating my burger like Gene Wilder and Willy Wonka, just like, mm-hmm. It was a very strange experience. But this is where he started. I mean, this is the first of many dot connectings that he did, always bringing things back to people's childhoods, which then led him to start doing private one-on-one counseling with people, and trauma became the word. But this is already in my 20s
Mhm.
and into my 30s, when he was now a published author. So the gap as a child was different. It was more just the gap between he takes care of people and helps the sick and all that, but he's kind of absent at home.
Mhm.
Um, in my adulthood, when he was no longer parenting me, yeah, I had complicated feelings about his work, um, especially since from the very start, starting with Scattered Minds, all of a sudden my childhood is in the pages of his book. And I don't really remember being asked if that was okay.
Hmm.
He didn't give any specifics, but there was a kind of boundary crossing, I think, um, using his parenting of me as a teaching tool. And what's really funny about that is I mean, some kids would, and my brother might be an example, although I think my brother was just led to journalism on his own. But some kids might just be like, well, I'm going to get as far away from that professionally as I can. I decided to work with the guy, to go into business with him,
Mm.
to edit his third book, Hungry Ghosts, and then write his fourth book, and then write his fifth book with him, and then do a workshop on parent adult child relationships.
Hmm.
So it's like my relation, or my working with him is sort of a living embodiment of the only way out is through. That was true for me. The only way out for me was to go right into the heart of the darkness and renegotiate my relationship with him in real time. But I will say that, just to get back to your question, it's always been a complicated thing for me, because, and not just because I have people DMing me constantly being like, I'm so jealous of you that he's your dad.
Hmm.
I would give anything to have him as my father. You must be so proud, or you must feel so fortunate. And
Hmm.
it's complicated because I am proud, and there are real perks to having him as a dad. Huge. But there are also complications that nobody who isn't me, who isn't the eldest son of him, can understand.
Hmm.
And there are ways in which the focus on childhood trauma, uh, it's a funny thing, but the sort of the the one size fits all explanation for everything being childhood trauma, which I think is more or less valid. Like, I don't disagree with it. But in some ways, his conversion to that way of seeing the world didn't help me uncover my own childhood trauma at all. In fact, in some ways, it obscured it, because he had his memory of my childhood trauma. But what's mine? And what if mine contradicts his? And is
Hmm.
there something maybe even self-serving about the way that he apologizes for the way he parented me? You know what I'm saying? So
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
still on the parent's terms. And he
Hmm.
has a better memory of it because he was a grown-up when it happened and I was a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old. So it's just complicated. It's just very, very complicated. But I think I've gotten to the point where I'm able to, like, have parallel vision. So on the one hand, I have my pain about it. I have my ambivalence about it, and that's mine. It's totally valid. And at the same time, over here, I'm just very proud of what he's created and very impressed with his work. And I see how many people need what he offers,
Hmm.
and if his method doesn't work on me, that's just as it should be, like, I need to find my own ways of healing, uh, because anything that sounds too much like him just doesn't hit the spot. It's not an antidote to what I'm carrying.
Yeah. What you were saying about how uh just like having that conversation with your dad about your own childhood traumas and how your recollection might contradict with his. I know that Leslie's had that conversation with people. We do workshops for families and we talk about this kind of stuff. We talk about, what was your childhood like? And, how are you as a parent trying to grow from that? And then sometimes people ask, like, do you ever do workshops with the parents and the children in the same room? Or can I do a workshop with the grandparent, parent, child? And we've cautioned on that because we say, you can do that, but you need to be aware that those conflicts are going to come up. You're going to have someone say, "Oh, I wasn't that bad," or "Oh, I don't remember it being that way." You're exaggerating. So yeah, I think the fact that you're able to sit down and not just have that conversation with your dad, but write books about it. I think, like, can you just, like, real briefly, like, what was that initial conversation like where you're like, okay, did he invite you in? Did you say I'd like to be a part of this? What was that like where you just said, I want to be a collaborator on this?
Yeah, so we had already worked together in the sense of me editing his work, but that's just me touching up his sculpture.
Yeah.
In 2016, someone approached us. I was living in Vancouver at the time, and she had this hunch that getting us on stage together would produce something valuable. She was the program director at a local retreat center that offered programs in the city. And I think she had seen us on stage once. Maybe I had guested at something where I happened to be there and I came on stage and I played a song or something like that. And she just had this brainwave that the two of us could do something interesting, but we didn't know about what. And I suggested, well, what about this thing about parents and children in adulthood, not parenting? I'm
Hmm.
not interested in doing a parenting workshop. I'm interested in doing a workshop about what happens after parenting. Because if you look in any bookstore, there's an entire section for parenting, shelves upon shelves of how to parent your child from conception to college drop off.
Hmm.
And then you have books on how to say goodbye to your aging parents, or how to grieve your dead parents, or how to deal with your demented or narcissistic parents, and a few books about how to kick your deadbeat 30-year-old kids out of your basement. But what there isn't is any exploration of what are we supposed to do in the meantime? And how are we supposed to deal with this important but kind of optional relationship? When you're grown-ups, you can see each other once a year at Thanksgiving. You can be estranged. You'll be fine. The job is done. You did what you did. The cake is baked. So how do we address it, and what's possible in it, and what are the opportunities? What are the pitfalls? And all of a sudden, this idea seemed to have some juice to it, because all of a sudden, both of our voices were required.
Hmm.
It was something he couldn't lead on his own. And so we designed a workshop, and we did a pilot workshop in 2016. And the very first moments of it can be seen on YouTube, and I think have by almost 500,000 people. Our Hello Again workshop from 2016. And you can see the friction between us right there on stage. We had a huge fight in the car on the way down to the event. And, but we knew it was juicy. We knew that there was something to it, and people were getting a lot from it. And they were even getting a lot from watching us kind of butt heads. And of course, if you look on YouTube, you'll see that some people interpret it very different ways. Some people are commenting that Daniel's a hothead and an ingrate, and he doesn't respect his father, and he should be more grateful. Some people are shocked and disillusioned. I didn't know Gabor was so petty and narcissistic, or whatever they call him. They call us both names. And then some of them are like, they're both assholes. But a lot of people are like, wow, this is my family. I see the humanity in both of them. And that was that's kind of what it was for.
Yeah.
We're two guys who don't have it all figured out. And we're not going to wait until we have it figured out to go explore this unexplored territory.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think that part too about just humanizing the both of you, which is something that I think people, when it gets online, when you get into online discourse, people just want to zero you into whatever kind of characteristics or bubble or box they want to put you in. But like, yeah, like you said, you're just human. You're just two guys trying to figure things out, trying to navigate your relationship. Um, I wanted to shift gears a little bit. Still kind of on the conversation around, you and your dad. But more focused on, I heard you talking about, I think it was in the Omega interview that you did, about how you were trying to really, or I don't know if it was like an active process for you, if it was just like something that you kind of were tuning into, but just like trying to unpack what your dad's traumas were like growing up. And so again, like Leslie and I, we just recently started interviewing our own parents.
Mm.
Our parents are both immigrants from Mexico. They came here as children or, adolescents, and they never really open up about like what those experiences were like. I know that my conversations with my mom recently, she talks about just how isolated she felt and the different trauma she felt, the discrimination, harassment she experienced coming over here. And that put her personality and her whole life into a new perspective for me. So I'm really curious, being that your father was an infant survivor of the Holocaust, what were those conversations like at the Passover table? What were you able to uncover about your dad's history, your mom's history? I know it was a little different. Um, but again, just like what were you able to uncover about your parents' traumas early on, and how did that impact you and your development?
Well, my mom's childhood was very different, but
Yeah.
it left a lot of scars. She grew up in Vancouver and after the Second World War. Um, well, my dad's always been very stoic. He didn't share very vulnerably. And it's kind of like, it's the Holocaust, right? What can you say? And he doesn't remember it. He was a year and a half when World War II ended. So there are the facts. I heard the stories of the Budapest ghetto and him almost dying and sleeping on a cold floor in a room with 16 people and being given to a non-Jewish woman on the street to convey him to his cousins across town. And I heard it from my grandmother too, but it was sort of like family lore. It wasn't, I didn't think of it as my dad's trauma. I just thought of it as kind of this burdensome history that I kind of feel sort of guilty about because I didn't go through that. Um, yeah, it was really only when he started writing about it for the whole world that I really got the full picture. But even then, you know, I've always wanted more from him in terms of, okay, what was the rest of your childhood like? Because I
Mhm.
know that my trauma didn't stop at age 2. The ways that my childhood molded me didn't stop at age 2. And there's something I don't like about this idea that it's only the first 2 years and then the rest is just determinism. No, like things keep happening and there are incidents that really bruise you or really kind of knock things out of joint or cause you to make decisions. And whenever I would hear my uncles talk about the rest of their childhoods, I would really prick up my ears and listen because my dad didn't talk about that stuff. So, recently on my dad's 80th birthday, my uncle Janos was telling the story of them being bullied by neighborhood anti-Semitic bullies. And I got really interested because my dad doesn't tell these vulnerable stories. Like, again, the Holocaust is kind of this airtight, like, it's just this ready-made trauma story, It it's not very personal in a sense. And it happened to him as an infant, so what is he can't remember. But when my uncle also told the story of the night before they emigrated to Canada, before they fled Hungary in the middle of the night to escape the Hungarian Revolution in 56, the two of them took a bath together, two brothers, a 12-year-old and a 10-year-old, and held each other and promised that they would always live in the same city and they would always take care of each other as long as they both lived. And that's just a side of my dad that he didn't share very much. My
Mhm.
dad, I think, likes to appear in control. And um, that always left me hungry for knowing the rest of the story, the rest of him. As far as my mom's traumas, I only heard about them really in my adulthood. My mom would sometimes speak about her childhood in idealistic ways, like how great her parents were. And it was only when I got to be a teenager and more of a grown up that I started seeing the ways that my grandparents were very unhappy people. They were wonderful people. I loved them and they were so good to me. But started seeing the contours of my mom's tense, complicated relationship with them as much as she loved them very much. So, yeah, I don't know that I had a real satisfying experience of my parents sharing their experiences with me. It was just very intense and like I've tried a number of times to ask my dad, well, what was your relationship like with your dad? Or what was it like as a teenager? Or did you have troubles with girls, But it just never goes very far. So yeah, I kind of envy you.
Yeah.
I would, there's something that I like or that appeals to me at least about having parents who are kind of a black box to you, which you can then, when you're grown up and you have kids and you're grounded in yourself, you can come to them with a kind of open curiosity. And maybe there'll be a time when I come back and ask my parents some more gentle questions. But I have to say, I have a bit of reactivity about it all, and if it's a point of tension, it's not going to be a very enlightening conversation if I'm
Mhm.
triggered already before I ask the question.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and I just think, that's something that more and more of us are looking to hear about, especially in the kind of work that we do, because central to the work that we do is understanding the context from where our parents came from and how they got to be the way that they are. So I think
Mhm.
the fact that, you're sharing like someone who is very focused on the work of childhood trauma, your dad, Gabor Mate, still having that sort of hesitancy to share those experiences. I think that's really interesting. Um, I wanted to talk about.
Well, it's not
Oh,
even.
go ahead.
I don't know. I don't know if he's hesitant. I'm just not sure if he sees the relevance of the rest of his childhood. I mean, because his early childhood story is so compelling and explains so much, I've wondered, but that's his business. That's just his business. And I can't get too deep into it, but it is a curiosity for me. And it's like a bit of a blank spot that I hope someday to fill in.
Mhm. All right, thank you. I wanted to talk about, again, one of the reasons that Leslie talked about that we really wanted to have you on here is just the way that you've been so outspoken about what's been happening in Palestine. And I think the fact that, you mentioned, I listened in that Hasbro podcast that you yourself early on were a program leader at a summer camp, like
Mhm.
promoting the idea of Zionism. So I wanted to hear a little bit about what were your early experiences learning about the Zionist project, and how did that concept for you evolve to the point where you're out here, going on IG Live telling everybody about why we should give a shit about what's happening in Palestine.
Absolutely. Can I just respond to something in the chat very quickly?
Yeah, go ahead.
Rudy says, my kids are 10 and 8, and I haven't figured out when to tell them about my childhood trauma. Rudy, here's the answer: when they ask, and not a moment before. Okay? They don't need to know. And as they get to know you better as a human being, when they have the space to see you as a full, complete person with a childhood of your own, they will ask, or they won't, but for now it's enough to say, I get it, I relate, you know but don't give them more than they can handle, and they will let you know what they can handle. Anything else is you trying to get something from them, or trying to allay some anxiety of your own. It's really your childhood trauma with them should be on a need to know basis, and they'll let you know when they need to know and how much they need to know. That's what I would say.
Yeah, on
Take
that
it
note,
take it from me.
yeah, from that note, again, we were Leslie was on a seminar or a session earlier this week talking with your dad, and we asked that question about how do you talk to your kids about conflicts and situations that are happening on the global stage where it's just in the news all the time, and you're hearing about it, and we're like, how do you have those conversations? And your dad said, well, you address it when they ask about it. You address the
Okay,
question.
good,
Yeah, yeah. He
good.
wasn't.
I taught him that. No, I'm just kidding. Maybe I did. I don't
No,
know.
but that's a good answer. Like you said.
Great minds think alike. So in terms of my early experiences with the Zionist project, I had an interesting experience of it because I had an anti-Zionist father, vocally anti-Zionist, infamously anti-Zionist. Although it's not that he was anti-Zionist, it's just he spoke up for Palestinian rights, which put him at odds with the Israel no matter what supporters, which dominated the Jewish community then, even more than they do now. There was no dissent back then. My dad had a group called Jews for a Just Peace, tiny little group. The JCC, the Jewish Community Center of Vancouver, wouldn't let them in the door, wouldn't let them rent space there, you know. And my dad went on a medical tour of the West Bank and Gaza and saw teenagers with their heads split open by Israeli so-called rubber bullets, was on national radio saying that he had cried every day since being there. Really made a big impression on me. But meanwhile, he was sending me to a Zionist summer camp because my whole family went. My uncles met both of their wives there. Um, my mom had been a camper there. My dad had been a lifeguard there. My cousin married her, ended up marrying her husband from meeting there. So it was just, we were just kind of an institution, and it was a left-wing Zionist camp. It was based on the kibbutz movement. So it was socialist. And we fancied ourselves very pro-social justice. So we would talk about women's rights and later gay rights and even Palestinian rights. There was some room to talk about the occupation as the Intifada started in the late 80s. And always were waving the banner of left-wing Zionism, the Labor Party, or even more left-wing, the Meretz Party.
Can you make a distinction real quick for the audience? Because I know some folks here and the people watching on YouTube later might know what Zionism is in a nutshell, but when you're saying left-wing Zionism, can you
Yeah,
make that distinction? What do you mean by that?
yeah. I'm not sure the distinction makes any difference anymore, but for a long time, there were different strains of Zionism. So Zionism, well, it used to mean an even wider array, a spectrum of views. But what it became basically as of 1948 was the view that the Jews need a state called Israel, which is majority demographic Jewish by law, right? In other words, that the creation of Israel and the way it happened is justified. Before that, there were cultural Zionists who were saying, "Oh, we need a homeland," because look, Jews looked around and in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, this is even before the Holocaust, and said this wandering the world, being in various places thing isn't going so well for us, as all the imperial powers are shifting, whatever. We're getting squeezed out. We're getting attacked. There's pogroms against us. There's anti-Semitic hate. And this is even before the rise of the Nazis. So the notion was we need a homeland. We need a safe place. Every other people has one. So we're going to see ourselves as a nation, not a religion, not an ethnicity, but actually a nation. And Palestine, the Holy Land, was decided on eventually as the place for it, although the earliest Zionists would have been happy with Uganda. And so there were some in the Zionist movement who said, wait a minute, whoa, whoa, whoa. This whole Jewish state thing is dangerous. Albert Einstein was one of them. Yes, we need a homeland. Yes, we have a connection to that land. But there are millions of Palestinian Arabs who live there. There's even Palestinian Jews who live there, Arab Jews who have lived there in peace with the Muslim and Christian inhabitants of that place for millennia. And if a bunch of Europeans come in and say, we're creating a Jewish state, well, we've seen what happened in America. We've seen what happened in Canada, Australia. We know what that entails. It means displacing and dispossessing and or exterminating a huge portion of the indigenous population. And we don't want Jews to become a people who does that. So they explicitly said this, but they didn't win. The side that won was the colonialist side. They were proudly colonialist and they wanted to, and for them it was, now some of them admitted that's what they were doing, and some of them acted like they wanted to coexist or have two states or whatever, but all of them fundamentally were like, it's a means to an end. We're going to get our state and all of this land eventually. And therefore, whatever we had to do to get there is justified. Now, some of them admitted what we had to do, and some of them pretended that we didn't have to do it. And I grew up in the tradition of the ones who pretended that we didn't have to do it. So we never really learned about the Nakba, which is the Palestinian word for the catastrophe of 1948, what Israelis call their war of independence. Our Jewish national victory and miracle was their catastrophe because 750,000 of them were deliberately removed, kicked out, or forced out, or chased out of their lands. Massacres, rapes, expulsions, house demolition, and a lot of Jewish settlements and cities built on the ruins of these Arab villages, renamed, all kinds of stuff. So just an entire new country sat on the graveyard of another, really. And they weren't allowed to return. They became refugees, either in Jordan, which at the time included the West Bank, or in Egypt, which at the time included Gaza. And then in 1967, Israel conquered both those territories and occupied them ever since. So I grew up in the strain of Zionism that said, you know, it's a shame that the Arabs have never wanted peace with us, but we should make peace with them and we should give up land for peace. So we saw ourselves as very enlightened and making compromises and things like that. So I went to the summer camp, and it was based on the kibbutz model, which is a socialist way of living, at least socialism for Jews. We did work groups, you know, we cleaned our own toilets, we took out our own garbage, we painted fences and buildings. I served breakfast. You know, collective ownership, collective responsibility. We would all bring a certain amount for the communal fund, and then we would have group meetings to decide how to use it. Do we want it on candy? Do we want it on a movie night? You know, we had some say in our own programming, and it really felt like a little community. And it was a great place. You know, Seth Rogen, I was his camp counselor there, and he's talked about how influential it was for him. I'd like to think I did something that rubbed off on him. Although he wrote about me in his memoir, he slandered me as Dan, the counselor who cried while playing Indigo Girls songs at the talent show. Never happened. Never happened, Seth. It's lies. Total cap. Just pure cap. As the kids say. But it was beautiful, and it was idyllic, and it was sexy too. Like it was like people were beautiful, and it was a kind of Jewish identity that was very earthy and hippie-ish, but also tied to the Middle East, which is a sunny place where people show their bodies and are very comfortable with themselves. It wasn't the nerdy, nebbishy Judaism of Eastern Europe. It wasn't the intellectual Judaism, although we took pride in that too. But we had Israeli summer camp counselors who were just fresh out of the army. And these people knew how to tie knots and how to, you know, do all kinds of cool things and set up a tarp in 2 seconds because they'd been in the army, and they would tell us stories, not very detailed stories, but stories of being in the army, and they understood loyalty and obedience and discipline and things like that. And these are not well-known European Jewish traits. This is what Zionism made of Jews.
Hmm.
So it was very sexy. Now, what were my first impressions? I had very mixed impressions because I liked the Hebrew that we learned. I really liked learning a new language. I liked the songs. I liked the dances. I didn't trust the rhetoric and the politics and what felt kind of fascist to me as a kind of worship of a state. It just didn't feel like Jewishness to me. So I preferred when we were talk about things that didn't have to do with Israel. And then
Hmm.
when I caught wind of my dad's opinions, now I had fuel. Now I started reading Chomsky. Now I started, you know, listening, I don't know, seeing Edward Said on television and learning a different perspective. And now I came back to summer camp guns a blazing, and I would make my cabin mates cry in activities when I would be talking about the suffering of the Palestinians, and they didn't know what I was talking about. But I'd be very impassioned because I'd seen my dad be very impassioned, and I kind of worshipped that about him. So it was complicated. And then I became a counselor, and look, it was such a good place for me socially. I mentioned my social difficulties at school. I didn't have those as much at camp. Even when my own age group would ostracize me, older kids and younger kids liked hanging out with me, and the counselors were always great to me. So it was a place where I could kind of let my freak flag fly and be welcomed for who I am. So I felt a lot of loyalty to it, and I went back and I was a counselor for 3 years, 4 years actually, and then I became a program director, and that was my final summer there. I think it was the year 2000, and I tried to design a program that pushed the envelope of really telling the Palestinian story, of
Hmm.
confronting the basic contradictions inside of Zionism. Yes, it gave us a state, and also, yes, it robbed another people of theirs, and that's their experience. And I wasn't even being moralistic about it. It was more like, until we deal with the truth of what happened, history is not going to leave us alone.
Hmm.
And that was the message I was trying to get across. And that we have a choice. Do we want to hang on to this sense of security we have, which with every passing year shows itself to be a false sense of security? Or do we want to take the risk of telling the truth and admitting that we did things that our side did things that are not to be proud of? And or do we want to cling to our illusions?
Hmm.
And that's kind of how I left it. And when I was done with that, I walked away from it. I stayed interested in the topic, but not active until October 8th, 2023, when I picked up my phone, and now there was something called Instagram 23 years later. And I just started talking into my phone, doing a walk and talk live, and just trying to give people the context for why what happened. Not that it was justified. Justification's got nothing to do with it. It's that it was inevitable. And if we don't understand, same message I was trying to impart at summer camp. If we don't understand the history, we're doomed to have it happen again and again and again. And we're going to make the same mistakes. So that's the story.
Yeah, that note about, not reckoning with the history and having to deal with the consequences of not dealing with that history. And when I listened to your IG live, I think that was something that stood out because it's difficult to have that conversation, especially for people like us who we're not Jewish, we're not Palestinian, we're outside observers here trying to make the most sense of what we're seeing, listening to some of the people that you've talked about, like Edward Said and Noam Chomsky, Norman Finkelstein, your father who's been outspoken on this, listening to
Yeah.
all that, trying to put the pieces together. And
Can
how
I
do you
can I challenge one thing you said?
go on?
You're not Jewish, you're not Palestinian. That's true. Do you pay taxes in the United States of America?
Mhm.
Then you're paying for this genocide.
Mhm. Yeah, and we've had that conversation because we've been trying to push local officials, politicians
Yeah.
to.
I'm not blaming you. I'm just saying you have grounds to speak. You have grounds to learn. You have grounds to have an opinion.
Mhm.
Anyone who tries to tell you you don't know enough, well, you should ask them how many of the authors you've just listed they've read. But more importantly, no one can take away your right as a citizen of the world, much less a citizen of the world's largest empire that is funding this thing to the hilt, making it possible diplomatically, totally underwriting it. You have every right, as much as anyone else, no matter what your identity. Don't let anyone use your identity against you ever, ever.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree with that. And what I meant by that is not to say that, we have no right to speak on this, but
Yeah.
it's wanting to make sure that we take in as much of the perspective as we can
Sure.
so that when we speak on it, we're not talking out our asses, that we actually have a solid grasp of what the situation is, you know?
But the same goes for me. I should endeavor to do that too.
Mhm.
I find myself sometimes saying the same things over and over again. And then an Israeli friend who agrees with me about things will challenge me on something I said. I'm like, oh, that was kind of lazy of me. You know, I don't need to be lazy in order to make my point. So we should all be exercising our right to have an opinion and to speak and to learn. And we should all be mindful that we're human and we're fallible and we can never know the whole truth. So, yeah, do your work, do your research.
Yeah, and again, what stood out to me when I listened to your IG live was I felt like it's like a radical empathy because
Mm.
you're really trying to push against the bounds of this tribalism that tells you this is your team and that other team is doing some horrible things. You should be standing with us. So I want to kind of get a sense of what your uh, response, what the response has been. And you know, like you said, you've been talking about this since those summer camp days. What has the response been? And something else that your dad talks a lot about is the influence of like peer attachment and the relationships and all that. Like, what is the impact of that for you as a I wouldn't want to, like you said, that you don't necessarily label as like a anti-Zionist Jew, but rather someone who's
Well,
pro.
no, I really am.
Okay, fair.
My dad doesn't use that term, but I'm perfectly comfortable saying it. I think Zionism's a cancer on Jewish thinking, feeling, and the Jewish experience. I just think at this point it's completely metastasized and needs to be composted. And which is to say, everyone who's there has the right to live there if they are willing to live with equality and freedom for everybody, which would mean no more quote unquote Jewish state, but a binational one. But anyway, the second part of your question is easy to answer. There hasn't been much impact on me. I'm sure there's some people who are keeping their distance from me, but most of the friends I have close to me in my life, I've already filtered out the ones who see the world fundamentally differently than me. And I'm not working for any institution. I don't have any boss or management team that I have to worry about. So I'm not having to toe any line or pull any punches.
Mhm.
Um, you said radical empathy. I don't mind that phrase. The only problem with it is it conveys a kind of it could convey a certain kind of gentleness, a kind of softness, like I'm going to be empathetic to everyone no matter what, and all that. And that's fine. My slight reframe of it, and I call myself a mental chiropractor. So if I just chiropract that phrase a little bit,
Mhm.
and I don't know if you'll put the link to my website in the show notes for
Yeah,
this,
yeah.
but
Well,
people can find out about that service. I'd say ruthless compassion. I prefer because if you watch my videos, and this is the response I get, and I was really surprised by it. I didn't think anyone was going to watch. I really didn't. I had a following, but it was all myth of normal stuff, which isn't even really my work. I mean, it is. It's a project I work on, but it's not my original work. But what people tell me is that watching it, they calm down and they feel regulated. My dad even used that term. He watched one of my Instagram lives. I didn't know he was watching. I think if he had, it would have messed me up. But he called me right afterwards. He said, I was feeling really agitated before, and my nervous system has regulated. And that's very interesting to me. I'm not sure how I'm doing that. I guess I'm regulating my own nervous system with my words. And the mental chiropractic thing is trying to speak as faithfully as I can to the truth, which sometimes means being pretty blunt. So I'm not being like, well, everyone's traumatized and, Israelis have feelings too. Yeah, of course Israelis have feelings too. Of course Israelis have trauma. But I'm just trying to treat everyone like grown-ups. And I just see how the same cliches keep us in a state of tension. And somehow the truth, plainly spoken, can help most of us regulate. Now, it's going to really agitate some people who don't want to see that truth. But for most people watching, the effect seems to be the combination of me being compassionate enough to be like, okay, if you have a counter argument, let's look at your counter argument. I'm not going to call you a Zionist. I'm not going to call you a colonialist. I'm not going to call you a racist. I might say that's a racist view, but I'm not going to throw insults at you. I'm going to say, let's look at what you're saying. Let's take it apart and seeing if it's valid. And also, what does that view get you? What are the consequences of that view? What does it feel like to hold that view? So I'm asking compassionate questions, but I'm ruthless about it. Like, I don't give a fuck, truly. And sometimes I get angry. then I'll say I'm angry, but I try to own my emotions rather than getting them all over everybody. So I'm being human and I'm interrogating my own views as I go. So I think there's something about that presence and that example that seems to give people something they need that feels medicinal in this time. And that, and then there's just gratitude from Palestinians that someone, anyone with a platform is speaking up for them because they've been so neglected and betrayed and forsaken by the world. And I hate that this is the case, but it is the case that the fact that I'm Jewish and the son of a Holocaust survivor and a former Zionist summer camp leader, all of these little identity badges give me like extra credit, which is stupid. It shouldn't, but it does. And so the fact that I'm using it to raise an alarm and to call for a ceasefire and to speak for universal principles means extra to a lot of people. And so I get a lot of gratitude for that too. And then I get some people coming at me, two kinds of hate mail, some people who want to have a conversation and some people who don't want to have a conversation. And I can usually tell the difference.
Mm-hmm.
Someone could be really agitated and angry at me, but I sense that there's something they're struggling with that they want my help with because they can't figure out why someone like me would say the things I'm saying. Or they wish I would be more gentle about it. They're trying to tell me that they're not ready to hear it. Well, I can have a conversation with someone like that. Someone who just wants to call me a capo, which is a word for a Nazi, a Jewish Nazi collaborator, they get the block, you know.
Yeah.
That's a kind of a no-brainer.
Yeah. You said that this your approach or your conversations have been like therapeutic for people. I think it's just honesty. I think people are just they see honesty and like you said, bluntness as refreshing when there's a lot of people out there who seem to be towing a line around a certain narrative, certain propaganda. It's just not like like you said, authenticity. I know that that's what people resonate with her page lives. She's just fully herself. She's not going to be trying to convince you of anything. It's just this is
Yeah,
what I.
just being yourself. The other thing I should say is that it's a function of my privilege as a white Jewish man who's reasonably financially comfortable at this stage of my life that I can afford to be lighthearted about it too. So I bring a lot of humor to my Instagram content. And I don't do it to make light of it. I do it to find some lightness that can help us stay afloat. A lot of people can't afford that. And I wouldn't expect a Palestinian right now. I can't believe Palestinians can even get out of bed right now. It's a testament to something that people has that I've never seen anywhere else.
Mhm.
Just what they've had to survive and what they're enduring right now, whether they're in Gaza or the West Bank or somewhere else, just watching. It's unthinkable what they're going through. I'm
Yeah.
over here with my guitars and my records and my piano and my nice little life in Brooklyn. And you know, I'm also an ironist. I'm a satirist. I see irony in things. I like to make fun of hypocrisy. That's one of the Jewish comedic
Mhm.
and philosophical intellectual traditions that I take the most pride in or identify with most about being Jewish. So I'm bringing some of that, laughing, gallows humor, laughing in the face of absurdity.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
so
And
that might be another tool in my arsenal that people respond to.
yeah, and I wanted to also mention, when you said, the fact that your identity badges shouldn't matter. Uh, I want to push back on that because I feel like something that we again center on a lot is the lived experiences of certain people from certain backgrounds offer not just credibility, but a perspective that you might not get otherwise from
That's
what.
fine.
Mhm.
That's fine. But why doesn't the lived experience of a Palestinian
Oh, I hear you.
have the same currency? They need to scream 17 times as loud and be 18 times as gentle as me to even get in the door. And if they get an interview, they have to be grilled. Do you condemn Hamas? Do you condemn Hamas? In fact, that was the reason I picked up my phone on October 8th, because I was seeing this on news shows that Palestinians were being required to answer for the crimes of their resistance group that they never necessarily supported,
Mhm.
whereas Jews are never asked to speak for or account for or atone for 80 years of Israeli aggression and crimes. So I feel you. It's fine that people value my voice based on my identity. What I'm speaking to is a complete and total power differential, which always happens in colonial power dynamics where it's the white savior thing. I remember my dad I first became aware of it when I was a kid, this will probably be before your time. There was a movie called Cry Freedom in 1988. It was the first time, I think it was Denzel Washington's first ever movie role or major movie role. And he was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor. He played Stephen Biko, the South African anti-apartheid fighter who was beaten to death by South African police. And I remember this great scene in it where this South African white Afrikaner lawyer he's on trial. He says, "You call yourself black, but you're more brown than black. Why do you call yourself black?" And Denzel Washington as Stephen Biko just calmly says, "You're more pink than white. Why do you call yourself white?" But Biko dies about at most halfway through the movie, and then the rest of the movie is about Kevin Kline, this boring ass South African journalist trying to figure out the truth.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember seeing it and being like, the first part of the movie was a lot better. And my dad said, this is typical of Hollywood. They're going to give the voice to the like American Vietnam War resistor. Same thing with, Born on the 4th of July by Oliver Stone. Great movie. But there are no movies from the perspective of Vietnamese villagers, millions
Mm-hmm.
of whom were killed by American bombs and napalm. So I'm just sort of saying I'll take it, but it feels a little unearned. It feels a little dirty
Yeah,
as
yeah,
a
yeah.
W. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I agree with what you're saying in that it shouldn't take the voices of people from the identity group that is responsible for the oppression
That's right.
to to give credence to the people who are being oppressed, who are
That's right.
constantly. Yeah, so I 100% hear you.
But,
I
but
think.
I will say that when Israelis speak up against it, I have nothing but respect for them because
Mhm.
they really have something to lose because they are living in a country that is not just bordering on fascism, it's full on fascist now. It's a lunatic country. The society has completely lost its mind. I have friends there who tell me they feel like they're living in Nazi Germany.
Mhm.
Literally, they say that. I saw a video of a Israeli kindergarten teacher, I think, or maybe high school teacher. It was a high school teacher who had been suspended and arrested for posting stuff supportive of the civilians in Gaza. And he comes back to school and he's walking through the courtyard, and all these Israeli kids, 10 years old, 11 years old, 12 years old, are shouting at him, calling him a son of a whore and an Arab lover, and telling him he's going to pay. Like this is mainstream now. So when Israelis find a way to tell the world the truth, I think that's really special. It takes very little courage for me to do what I'm doing. I'm just doing something I feel obliged to do. I'm not being overly modest. I'm just saying I have nothing to lose, really. But there are people who have things to lose, and anyone who's doing this when they have something to lose, my hat is off to them.
Mhm. Yeah, and again, I just really want to emphasize, like, don't undersell or undervalue the contribution that your
I'm
commentary has.
not. I'm not. I'm
Yeah.
great. I'm the shit. It's great.
No, and
But
I don't mean
but
just you. I mean in general, hearing from we work in a coalition with Palestinian and Jewish organizers, and
yeah,
we know that it's gonna help wake other people up who either are indifferent on the fence.
sure.
Yeah, so
You
that's
know
what.
who came up to me at an event the other day? I went to a Palestinian concert. And a guy walks up to me and introduces himself as a jazz musician from Chicago. And he had a really serious look in his face. And he said, I want to thank you, because your videos have been keeping me sane. I'm Jewish. He said, I have a pretty famous sister who's been very vocally supportive of Israel's attack on Gaza. I said, who is it? He said, Amy Schumer.
Oh my God.
Yeah, right, Leslie? And he said, I've been sending your videos to her. And she says, oh, well, he doesn't speak for most Jews. And I said, well, that's the point. He said, yeah, exactly. But I said, look, if she's ever willing to have lunch with me and you, and she just wants to like hurl, insult jokes at me, I'll take it. And then I'll ask her if she's open to a conversation. But that meant a lot to me. And having people approach me, especially Palestinian, I'm not, part of it is me using humor to like deflate my own inflated ego. Because believe me, it does go to my head. So
Yeah, yeah, I can respect that.
thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I'll take the acknowledgement. Just
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
it.
yeah. All right. So I did want to give. I know we're a little over time right now. If we could just get to some of the Q&A questions here.
I can go until half past.
Okay, beautiful. So let's see here. Leslie, you want to take over on this?
Yeah.
Leslie, that's an excellent background. The book, I mean. I'm talking about the book. No, 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 over your other shoulder. That one there. Exactly, The Myth of Normal. Thank you. Can't hear you.
You're on mute, baby.
All right, okay. Can you mute yourself?
Mhm.
Okay. So we did drop links to your website, to the mental chiropractic. I went
Thank
to
you.
your booking page, so you may be hearing from me.
Word.
Because writing a book is hard. Who knew? And yeah, so there's some stuff there. I wish we had another hour because I feel like there's so much that you talked about that could easily branch off into other really amazing conversations. And so I just wanted to extend my gratitude first and foremost. We did have some questions that came in. And you know, one of them obviously came in a little bit earlier in the conversation. So I'm going to go ahead and just go in chronological order.
Sure.
Manolo was asking, well, first said, thank you for the openness, Daniel. What advice would you give to parents, myself included, with a sensitive child? So I think that was when you were talking about, you know, your own sensitivity as a child, and what advice would you give?
Well, remember what the word sensitive means. And, you know, here I'll borrow from my dad's work. If a thermometer is sensitive, what does that mean? If a guitar tuning device is sensitive, what does it mean? It means it picks up on smaller, more subtle variations in energy than a non-sensitive instrument would be. It'll react more strongly to less intense input. So when someone says to somebody, oh, you're so sensitive, what they're really saying is, you're overreacting, you're making things up. But actually, no, if you're really sensitive, that means you should listen to the sensitive one. Now, it is possible to be, I wouldn't say it's possible to be oversensitive. It's possible to be hypersensitive, where your sensitivity gets so overtaxed that you react disproportionately to what's happening. And that's what happens to kids whose sensitivity isn't honored from the start. Because and that's what happened to me. You know, if so for instance, my sensitivity to the bad vibes in my home caused me to like be anxious. And if my anxiety was made wrong, well, then I have to go even further with it, or I have to get sick. Whatever it takes to get what I'm actually asking for. So the first thing I would say is, if you have a sensitive child, assume that they're picking up on what's happening. Trust their antenna as a faithful representation of something. Now, their little minds may, and in fact probably will, make up stories to explain what they're feeling that might not be accurate. And then what parents get into the trap of is arguing with the child about the facts. But it's not about the fact, it's about the emotional content that's registering in their little sensitive nervous systems. So if your child's nervous system is dysregulated, if they're picking up on something, it's much better to be curious about what they're picking up on than it is to haggle with them about how they express it or what they think the cause is. And then to be interested in their experience as well. And you're going to have to watch your own reactivity to their reactivity, because parents get into the trap of reacting to their kids' reactions. And now you got two toddlers in the room, except one is huge and has all the power, and the other one is small and has all the need. That's what I would say. It's something to be honored and developed. And I think a sensitive child ideally needs to be helped to trust their own sensitivity, to honor it, to set boundaries so that it can be protected. The word no is the OG boundary. You know, it's the first boundary a child will ever set. Well, actually, that's not true. Crying and squirming is a kind of physical boundary. So just handle with care and realize that whatever genius your child has, whatever creativity, talent, way with people, so many of their gifts are going to be completely tied, and they're going to stem from their sensitivity. So if they have a healthy relationship with their sensitivity, all of those wonderful gifts that'll make their lives so rich and contributive will have a chance to grow in a healthy way.
Thank you for that. And it reminds me of, I have a 6-year-old who's extremely sensitive, and I've tried as best I can to let her know what a gift that is also, because it means that she can really attune. But it's also made me grapple with my own sensitivity and the fact that I don't necessarily have a blueprint for how to navigate a sensitivity with a child because I was not granted that same level of attunement. And so I just want to invite parents to, continue doing your inner work. The Myth of Normal is a really amazing resource for more information on that as well. So thank you
Yeah,
for
and
that.
I would say that parents might say, well, my child is so much more sensitive than me. That's possible. It's also possible that you got desensitized in childhood, which means it's an opportunity for you to resensitize yourself, because being sensitive is painful. It means that you're going to feel more pain. It's going to take less to make you feel more pain. And if you became a tough person or a rational person, or whatever ways people develop to get through life, then your child's sensitivity is going to especially trigger you. So if your child's sensitivity triggers you, chances are there was something about your own sensitivity that was not treated well in childhood. And that's an opportunity for you to do some work.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. There was somebody that mentioned in the Q&A, not a question, but just says, as Daniel speaks, I'm struck by the challenges that every parent has of balancing who they are as someone's parent while also struggling to retain their own sense of who they are on their own. That was an anonymous attendee. And then another person.
Can I say something to that?
Yeah, absolutely.
There are friends of mine who are parents, since I'm not one, so I get to be around parents. And I think I'm actually blessed to be surrounded by a friend group, all of whom are just extraordinary parents, many of them, you know. And what I love, what I find medicinal when I walk into their homes, is that I don't sense that there's any kind of, if I could use a political term, apartheid between who they are as people and who they are as parents. It's just that it's a different role. And so they're not going to dump everything about themselves on their kids. They have appropriate boundaries, but their kids also just see them as people who are all living in the same house and have different needs and responsibilities. And that changes over time as the kids get older and the parents get different jobs and all kinds of stuff. So even the notion that you have to keep a balance between the two, that's kind of like this work-life balance phrase that's so terrible because it suggests that work isn't life and life isn't work. So just examine that, you know, is there a way to bring who you are to being a parent and, you know, be appropriate and protect your kids from TMI, but um, but don't think that you have to. Kids don't want you to play a character called the perfect parent. They want a relationship with you, the person.
Yeah, absolutely. And I actually am really glad that you used the word apartheid, because so many of the conversations that we have are the ways that we perpetuate colonization in our interpersonal relationships,
Sure.
beginning with the ways that we try to control and dominate over children. So, the whole decolonizing parenting movement that I feel like I'm a part of is speaking to that. The
Yeah.
way that, it's all just power dynamics and how we share that power and how we understand the context of it. So thank you for that.
Yeah, of course.
Um, Another question. I'm curious if your siblings experienced similar treatment or if your parents had grown up by the time the others came along.
I'm not going to speak for my siblings. It's not appropriate for me to do that. I will say that my parents had not grown up by the time my siblings came along. They had just the chaos had taken a different form. Um, and I would be hard pressed to say which of us had it the hardest. That said, it's not for me to speak about. I mean, I'm the only one out of the three of us who has gone out into the public world and made my childhood and its difficulties uh, part of what I do in the world, and it just wouldn't be appropriate for me to drag theirs into a public conversation.
Okay, thank you for honoring that. This last question, we talked about this a little bit, or I heard you two talking about it earlier, but I think this person may want to ask that we expand on it. They say, to put this conversation in the context of parenting, how and when, if at all, do we bring up the issues of colonization and social injustices with our children, especially connecting the dots for them to see how all colonization is essentially the same?
Yeah, well, that's a tough one. I think I would need to be a parent to have too much insight into that. But look, your kids are going to be interested in the world they're living in from a young age because they're trying to find their place in it, right? And you do have a role as a parent to shape their view of the world and their understanding of it. And I don't know if it's useful to put jargon like social justice warrior jargon like colonization in their heads at a young age. Maybe some of them are little political geniuses and are going to write manifestos by the time they're 9. I don't know. But tell your own family's history. That's political, especially if you're from a marginalized group. You know, I'm speaking to a lot of people from the Latino community. I mean, your history is your family's history is a part of the larger history. It's inextricable. You can't, nor should you, protect them from it. It's not something to be protected from. It's part of who they are. It's part of how your family got to be. And as they get more and more curious about it, then you can widen the lens, and unless you're living in a gated community, or in a cave, you're going to be driving down the street, you're going to see homeless people, you're going to be watching the news, and there'll be stories about violence, and they're going to hear lyrics from songs that refer to things that, what's that about? Well, it's part of the world, So it's kind of an art form, I would say, probably, to listen for what's underneath the question. And I guess to try and do what I've been doing with my videos, which is to orient them. Orient, not in the sense of Oriental, the East. I mean, orienting as in map making, giving them a sense of place and where they fit in it. And that'll be different at different ages. But you'll also feel their energy if something in them settles down in your answer or gets more agitated. And you can also ask them, what are you wondering about? Like, what's the question underneath the question? And I would think that just trust yourself and you'll know what to say. And then when it's time, show them Manufacturing Consent, the Noam Chomsky documentary. Get them Frantz Fanon, The Wretched of the Earth. And, they'll be off to the races.
Yeah, one of the things I wanted to
Or
add,
is that Pablo for Pedagogy of the Oppressed? I think I got the two authors wrong, but anyway, yeah.
No, Frantz Fanon is Wretched of the Earth. I wanted to say what a joy it's been to have those conversations now with my daughter who's turning 12. Over the summer, we read young people's history in the United States. So those are very
Howard Zinn.
And so it's edited for young people. So that's
Perfect.
another that I highly recommend.
Yeah.
Howard Zinn's People's History when she was in utero. We read that out loud to her. And so I'm like finally at the point where I feel like she is able to digest, and she is asking questions, and she is asking about her family history, and she's very proud of her roots. She's half white. My co-parent is a white man. And so it's just interesting to kind of, see where she is and all of that and be very curious about her, and then let her know that I don't know everything. Right. And so a lot of it.
That's great. That's so important. I wish I'd had more of that in my childhood. My parents telling me they don't know everything. Music also is a great way to introduce them. I remember it was a huge part of my political upbringing. The Weavers, Pete Seeger, labor songs, folk music from all over the world. I just repatriated some of my childhood LPs from my parents in Vancouver, and there's like a Peruvian Andean group that I loved as a kid, and just hearing the sounds of different peoples in the world. And inevitably, if you're listening to the sounds of Black and brown artists, you're going to be hearing songs of struggle and suffering and colonial subjugation and the lyrics. And you can, and there's we're living in a day and age where any decent children's bookstore in most major cities will have, at least in states that they're not being banned, will have material that'll help orient the kids to a world that's pretty out of whack.
Yeah, that makes me want to create like a playlist for parents of like, okay, if you want to like just
That's a great idea. Maybe we can collaborate on that.
I'm really down because I'm wanting to recommend people like Kimya Dawson and just people who, a lot of folk singers. Yeah, Dylan, things like that. Masters of War has been playing in our house. So just grateful for that. Like felt
how does your 6-year-old react to the final lyric of Masters of War?
She doesn't. She's just like, painting her toenails or something. Like it just so
do
much
do a kid's version, and I'll stand over your grave till I'm sure that you're fast asleep.
We turn the volume all the way down and we just say fast asleep. Yeah. So
no, I think even a 6-year-old could get that song.
I think so too.
Because it's about anger. It's about being angry at injustice.
Absolutely. Yeah. So
and about power.
And my 5-year-old is very much, a resistor and gives me opportunity, I will say, to practice my decolonial ways with him.
Excellent.
All
All right, folks.
Thank you. I'm so grateful to you. I hope that we can reconnect down the line. We're going to make this available for everybody on YouTube. We'll send you the link once we have that going. So if you want to share it, you can. Thank you to everybody that attended. Please do share this conversation. It is free. So we hope that everybody has access to the many gems and wisdom that Daniel shared. So appreciative to you. Thank you to my partner, Fernando, who's across the room right now, for being awesome too. So thank you, everybody.
And real quick, sorry to echo. Can we give I want to give Daniel some room. Can you tell people where to find you on social media, website? We'll put all this in the description as well, but just anything that you want to share.
Oh, sure. So my musical theater work and all that stuff is at danielmaté.com, and my mental chiropractic service called Take a Walk with Daniel. And yes, take a walk literally, usually by phone if we're not in the same place, but we'll both be walking. You can read all about it at walkwithdaniel.com.
All right, beautiful. Thank you again. Talk again soon.
All right, peace.
Bye, everybody.
All right.
See if we can hear it. Oh, you left your phone.
Oh, no.
Oh, we're still recording. Stopping recording now.